So now there's an interesting thing about charging. I'm going to paint this leaf with a bright yellow green. And I use charging a lot when I'm painting leaves and things like that. I'm going to stick some dark blue down here at the base of my leaf and into that stem. So charging gives me soft edges, and I can suggest light and shadow on that leaf. But what if, when I painted my leaf, I had so much water on my brush that it was sitting in a puddle? When I come back in to charge, if it's too wet, the paint isn't going to go anywhere. It's just going to sit there. Because what actually creates that soft edge is the water and pigment being absorbed by the paper. And as the paper is drawing in the moisture, i.e. drying, it's going to start pulling. When I've got so much water on my paper that it's sitting as a puddle, I don't get that pulling effect. I don't get that nice softening. So when you're doing your charging, you want to make sure that your paper is beginning to absorb that first wash, whether it's water or whether it's another pigment. If I draw most of the water out of this, I'm just using my sponge, my brush kind of as a sponge to wick it up. And then I come back in, you can see that it's starting to draw the pigment a little bit because the paper is drying and pulling some of that pigment. I came back with the brush and kind of softened it in, which brings me to our next is going to be a softened edge. And I've showed you a little bit of that, but I will give that to you more specifically.
On the charging, then you ended up putting dark.
I'll charge in a second color, or I'll charge in a little bit of dark. So I cautioned you about charging and trying to charge on something that's just too wet. But I also want to caution you about coming into charge and having too much water. If I take a bunch of water and stick it onto that, like I'm trying to charge in another color, it's going to create a blossom, a very hard edge, because I've put too much water into the wash. And it's going to start to get absorbed by the paper, right? And as soon as it gets to a point where the paper is too dry, it's going to leave a hard, ugly edge. And that's what happens when you come back with too much water. So here I showed you what happened when you started with too much water. And here I'm showing you what can happen when you come back in with too much water. So one of the keys to successful watercolor is controlling the amount of water that you're using. And in areas where it's really important, I'll try to remind you and to show you examples of the types of things that will happen when you've got either too much or too little water. All right. Everybody good with their charging? Looks good. So the next thing we're going to go on to is a softened edge. And this is another technique that I use a lot. I mean, a lot. If you can master softening an edge, you're going to have much more successful paintings. So when I say soft edge, there are basically two edges that you'll find in a painting. There's a hard edge and a soft edge. So if you take a shape and you paint it onto your paper, all four of these edges are sharp. And we need, or hard, they're hard edges, and hard edges will describe something. The outside edges of my leaf are describing the shape of the leaf. And every successful painting should have a combination of hard edges and soft edges. So I'm going to soften, not this whole edge, but just a part of this edge here. I've cleaned my brush. I'm just taking out the extra water. I'm not completely drying it. I'm just taking out some of the water. And then I'm going to tickle that hard edge. And my belly of my brush, I'm pushing down to dampen the paper out here so I get a nice soft edge. So I've softened here. This time, I'm not going to take out the excess water, and I'm going to try to soften that edge, and we'll see what happens. We're getting that blossom again. We're getting that situation when I've added too much water and it's pushing all the pigment, and it will continue to push that pigment until it gets to a point where the paper's too dry and it's leaving a hard edge. I'm going to bring this up to the camera. So down on that left-hand corner, that is the beginning of a blossom. And if you begin to have that happen in your paper, one of the things that you might do is panic and take a paper towel and say, oh, I got to get that off there. Well, look what it does. It just lifts. It doesn't soften that edge. So when you're softening an edge, your original wash should still be damp. You're just using the tip of the brush to soften the edge and the belly of the brush to dampen the paper beyond where you want that edge to soften. So now I have some hard edge, some soft edge. And I'll do this technique a lot when I have a long, hard, straight edge in my painting. A straight line is not a great thing to have with a hard edge all the way through your painting. It's just very fast, and the eye travels across it very fast. So what I'll do is I'll just come back in and soften part of that hard edge, making that line a lost and found, so that visually it has a little bit of a break in it.
So you wet the brush, but then you dry it with a paper towel?
Exactly. I wet the brush, but then I take most of the water out of it. And then I come in and soften. If I don't take that extra water out, it's going to push my pigment and create blossoms. And this is a wet lift. What we're going to do is I'm just going to take all the colors that are on my palette, and I want you to put some color on the dry lift side.
That's on the separate one.
This is on the other sheet. This is a lifting technique or a taking it off technique. And then I'm going to paint the wet lift side. I'm only having you put some color on this dry lift side because I want it to be there for tomorrow's class. Or excuse me, Tuesday's class. We're just going to let that dry lift side dry. But on the wet lift side, I'll let you get those two painted.
So you're
putting some color, it doesn't matter what it is. Putting some color on the dry lift, we're going to ignore that. We're putting some color on the wet lift. And then I'm going to take, I like to use my flat brush. I've cleaned it. I'm taking out the excess water. And I'm going to lift some of that paint right off. So this is a wet lift, and what a wet lift does is it gives us very nice soft edges. Remember, watercolor pigment will go wherever the paper is wet. And even though I'm lifting the pigment off here, the paper is still kind of wet. So I might have to go back and babysit that a little bit if it might creep back in. But now I could see this could be a tree and this could be a little lake. I can also use my round brush and lift off a shape that might become a leaf. I use lifting a lot, and this is called a wet lift. And if I were careful, I could make little trees at the other side of the lake. You can do all kinds of things. That's your wet lift.
Oops.
Wet lifting leaves us a nice soft edge. So the one thing I want you to do is take your 5x7 piece of paper, get the sketch, transfer the sketch onto there, and then I want you to do a wet into wet underpainting on that sketch. We're going to use the red, the yellow, and the blue. And you just need to have this ready for Tuesday. And if you have any trouble finding the sketch, don't hesitate to give me a call. The recorded session will be up there for you to review how to do a wet into wet underpainting. I'm applying water to the paper. I'm completely ignoring the sketch lines. And I'm dropping in my color. I always start with yellow and then add a little red. A little red goes a long way, you'll find. And then blue. Try to make these shapes random. So, you know, don't make them all the same size. And then just pick your paper up and let those colors run together. It may seem like an obscene amount of tone or value, but remember, watercolor pigment fades as it dries, and it will fade up to 40%. As long as your colors are running, you want to keep babysitting this piece of paper. If I were to stop here and walk away, I've got a big puddle of water down here, and you know what's going to happen. It's going to push up into my painting, and it's going to leave a hard edge of dropped pigment where the paper is too dry to accept it. So as long as we've got water moving our pigment, we want to continue turning our paper. I like to turn it and hold it until the water beads at one end. Ultimately, you get to the point where you won't have water beading anymore. Here's an area where it wasn't real wet. You can take your finger and push that. One quick thing, when you're transferring your pattern onto your paper, you want to use a pencil that's not too heavy. A number 2 pencil works really well, and that's very similar to what's considered an HB. If you take a pencil like this is a 4B, which means very soft, I guess you can't see that, it makes a very dark line, and it leaves more graphite, and sometimes that graphite will get picked up in with your pigment and get moved around on your paper. So you don't want too much pencil on your watercolor paper. And this is what I want you to have ready for next Tuesday's class.